Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of the panel today. And thank you very much for allowing me to share my experience. So I'll be the first speaker in the session. I'll be setting the context to the topic, as Kalana mentioned. It's about transferring thoughts without translation loss. So this is something that I deal with on a daily basis at different scales and levels. So I'll be setting the context from a business point of view. So I kind of represent the business analysis, the product owner, or in a holistic way, the product management side of things, where the translation loss really matters because we are essentially the carriers of information in the software development life cycle. Once I set the context, the story will continue. I'll be supported by Lahiru and Amila consecutively to carry on with the session from architecture and the engineering side of things. So just before I get into the session, sorry, next slide, please. So something to share, something that kind of struck me a couple of years ago. As Kalana mentioned, so I come from a company who builds technology products. I represent London Stock Exchange Group Technology, the Sri Lankan arm. We build financial market software and we provide solutions globally. And we compete with tier 1 grade global companies in our bids and trying to win solutions, etc. And what we are offering are pretty much ground up built by the Sri Lankan engineering brains. It's essentially a Sri Lankan product that we build. As you could imagine, because we are providing solutions to financial markets, which are naturally mission critical systems. Whenever there is a go live, we go on headlines because we are catering solutions to major financial centers like New York, Toronto, London, Paris, Milan, amongst many other financial centers around the globe. A few years ago, immediately after a go live, sort of a milestone, I was approached by someone who is not a Sri Lankan, and during an interview, I was asked, you come from a country where you don't really have a mature financial market, but you guys seem to have the best-in-class products. Where do you think this is coming from? And he was surprised to see that. And that kind of struck me, to really get into the details of what a software really is. So I gave it some thinking to realize this is applicable not necessarily to the company that I represent. I think it's applicable to all the software companies in Sri Lanka because there is something that we all share. And that is we, for a reason that I can't really articulate, we have a strong mind, we can think deep, and we are very strong in conceptual thinking, and we have a really good imagination. That kind of gave me kind of a lead to think about what a software really is. A software, if you really look at it, next slide, please. It's a conceptual artifact. You can't touch it. It's not tangible. But it's there and it's being used by people, from the product owners, business analysis, product management, whoever who is trying to elicit the requirements. You will be talking to a bunch of people trying to grasp what's inside their minds and then giving it back to the development engineering and the architects who are crafting it. And eventually somewhere down the line, it's going to be used by people. So it's a sort of a conceptual artifact. It's sort of a collective thinking that's manifested through the software. So this gives the ground basis for today's topic. You are essentially talking about, collective imagination. That's the software. And the moment you have multiple people trying to build a collective imagination, you can imagine where I'm going with this. It's going to be extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to have the imagination synced up. We have limited senses to share our thoughts and mind, and we struggle. So where I come from, the bridge of the problem versus the solution, the engineering solution and the business problem, it's even difficult for us. Next slide, please. Back in 1998, there was a massive project back then. It was one of it was all on media. Everybody was looking forward to that specific project, which was NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter. It was launched successfully. It reached Mars. It was orbiting for a couple of days. As it was trying to settle around a specific orbit, it crash landed, crashing the entire project and all the money spent with it, close to about $327 million US. As people looked at where things went wrong, to realize the project was done by two separate groups located in two separate geographic locations, communicating with one team communicating the units, the calibration, the software, etc., in the SI units, the kilometers and the kilograms, and the other team was communicating the same set of numbers, but on a different scale, the pounds and miles. And the conflict of this understanding, although the numbers were precise, actually led to the entire project being crashed in space. That's completely crashed. Same slide. Hubble telescope, on the other hand, no crashes, luckily. Touch wood, don't think it's going to crash ever. It was a massive investment, $4.7 billion. It's in the software language still live and running. Launched back in 1990. But as you might be aware, there are misses and weaknesses and slight deviations of things that you would call it a defect, but you will have to ignore that for the simple reason, if you were to fix even a small solar panel that's in the wrong place, you'll have to might cost you like $80. But for you to even replace that, you'll have to spend close to about $200 million to carry it in a spacecraft with a couple of astronauts. You have to reach Hubble telescope, fix it in free space. The problem is very small, but it will take about more than $200 million to fix it. So this gives you a different dimension. So what I said earlier, a software is an artifact of the collective imagination. That's what it is, because you can't touch it. On the back of that, people who are involved, as much as you realize that it's inevitable that you can have misunderstanding, translation losses, etc., there is a limit to that. And how you can, pay that cost, it could be a complete crash, or it could be something that you kind of, put under the carpet, but somewhere down the line, it might come back and bite you, and it'll be extremely costly to fix it. So that's where things are when it comes to translation losses. So from business analysis, product owners or the product management standpoint, the key idea is to be able to understand where things can go wrong and where things can go wrong through translation losses and try and cover that. Like I said, it's inevitable. You can't tighten all the loose ends. There will be losses in translation because you're talking about a bunch of people trying to collectively build something on a conceptual framework. But it's important that you identify where things can go wrong in terms of translation losses. I'm going to share a couple of experiences, at least what I went through a few years ago. The first one, it's about, I'm sure if you are part of a project, you might have heard this sentence quite a lot, like, don't tell a requirement, just talk about the rationale first. And that's what I would usually call the business case. Even a single line as a requirement has to be backed by the context and the entire picture behind it, which is the rationale. The reason being, like I said, we have limited senses. You're trying to tell something to the other person. Over the course of billions of years, we have figured out a way to do that, and which is to tell like a good background story and then tell the requirements. This is the context. So I experienced that, and I experienced the positive side of addressing that back in 2009. We were awarded with a project in Wall Street to provide a system to a hedge fund. A massive hedge fund in terms of investment. And we were a bunch of guys who have never even seen a hedge fund. We couldn't even imagine what a hedge fund would look like. And we were supposed to be talking to a bunch of traders who were ex-managing directors of Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Banks, the major banks in Wall Street. We didn't even know the language we need to talk to them. So we really struggled. The documented requirements were clear. It might say A plus B is C, C plus A is something like that. It's very logical. But the context behind that was very, very vague. So we captured that. Like I said, my starting pitch, the way I pitched it to say, look, we carry something really important, like a proposition in us. We have a great imagination. We can think deep. We are conceptually strong as a nation to start with. And something we actually kind of looked at when we struggled with the context of this project, we started appreciating that who's going to build this software for us. Backed by what I said earlier, this whole conceptual thinking, we have strong and brilliant engineering team. That needs to be the theme whenever you tackle a specific problem in the software industry. You need to appreciate that the team who is going to build this. So what we did was, of course, the ideal way, this is very similar to junk in, junk out, good stuff in, good stuff out. We started, giving the full view into the hedge fund business to the engineers. We screen movies. We spend time watching movies with them on how the trading community lives their daily life, the interesting stories around their life cycle, what they really do inside the business. And in fact, we even recreated some of their working environments in our company so that the engineers can feel it. So that actually set a really good context and curiosity. So this is more implied push for them to even go back and read, do the context reading, be familiar with the business. Whenever we started telling the requirements, we saw good resonance with the engineering team. At the same time, we did our homework. We spent a couple of nights thinking about the requirement, where it comes from, the context. We similarly handled the client in a similar fashion. What we figured over the course of 2 years, that we started thinking ahead of the client. It was a remarkable transformation. So the key point there is that, of course, you can try solving the translation loss through the artifacts, but they're just artifacts. For instance, having a beautiful document with nicely written words will not make any sense if you don't have the context. If you really want to have the context, you need to have that imagination. You need to have that exposure. You need to imagine what that requirement is about and where it's going to be used, which you call the rationale and the context. So we actually fed everyone with the required background, and it worked really well. The artifacts were just, mediums of communication. It didn't really add any value once you understand the context. So we saw remarkable output in the sense that even if you give a single line as a requirement, what we get back from the engineers were like very future-proof, very solid, very resilient. And even the client was really happy with the way we address certain problems because they understand the context. This is what it is in the engineering discipline. Another example, so there was a system that went live this March in London. We built a clearing and risk system for the London Clearing House. It went live, it went on news. One of the most critical projects, so to speak, even for the London financial market. It was a pivotal system for them. So we delivered it. And to let you know that it was delivered on a ground-up build that happened over the course of 5 years. It was built by 9 Scrum teams, talking to something reflective on the client, and also we had to be talking to people in London and Paris. Similar workforce were there talking to us, giving us the requirements. So there were lots of moving parts. We tried the same thing. Of course, we tried Scrum. We tried to get the client into the Scrum team. We had about like a massive overhead team managing the dependencies, etc. But we
I think Najith is
Yeah.
going through a power cut. I'm thinking. So what we'll do is we'll let Najith continue the rest of his presentation, and Kalna, let's move on to the next bit, right?
Yeah, let's move on where we probably. Oh, yeah, Najith is here.
Najith is
Hi.
here.
Oh, okay. Hi. Sorry
Okay,
about
Najith
that.
again.
I
No
had
problem.
pre-warned Kalna about this. I was going to lose my connection. Sorry. So I'll be very
Fine.
quick on my final remarks. So we spent about, like I said, 5 years, 9 Scrum teams with another massive team doing the overhead management of dealing with dependencies. But we stuck with the concept that we need to set the context. We spent a massive time period explaining the business to the teams. We didn't rush into the development straight away. Spend like a significant portion of our development time, massaging the thinking process. Because something that we have realized is that we have I think anywhere in Sri Lanka, like I said, all software companies are equipped with brilliant engineering minds. They're just begging for the right problem to fall on their laps. So it's about telling them the business problem as seen by the business, not seen by somebody else. So it takes a long time. It takes a long time for you to grasp the business, but it's worth an investment. Once you do that, even a single line, when you give it to a developer, it's been followed up with a massive thought process in their head, and the output is bunch of codes. So you can't measure the gravity of a requirement looking at the number of lines in the code or just number of lines in the requirement. It's the thought process. It's the imagination. So when you follow that philosophy, you'll start appreciating that the brilliance of the output. They give you something that you haven't even expected. It's obviously above what you expect. So that I experienced. So the couple of cents I can offer you is that just believe in the brilliant minds of engineers. Just make sure you give them the right imagination, right picture, right context, right rationale, and the documents, the graphs, the images, the mind maps, those are just artifacts, just like using words, but it has to be backed with the meaning. So that's essentially the context. How do you manage losses in translation and try and tighten loose ends wherever it makes sense from the business point of view. So that's pretty much the context from the business point of view. And if you have any questions, please feel free to log into Slido on this link and using this QR code. And Lahir will continue, once we offer the requirements to the engineers with the right imagination, you transfer that to them. How do you make sure it actually lands on the code and it comes back to the client with the right expectation from a software point of view?